Hi, this is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video, I will be taking a look at Iroshizuku Tsuyu-kusa. I'll do a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper with a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll take a look at writing samples that I did earlier on other types of paper. I'll compare Tsuyu-kusa to other blue inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. Tsuyu-kusa came off a glass dip nib nice and uniformly, and it was very pleasant to write with. The swatch that I made with tweezers was nice and crisp. There's not much of a difference in darkness between the beginning of the swatch and the end of the swatch, so there might not be a whole lot of shading in the writing samples. The drip at the end of the swatch has the tiniest halo of, looks like maybe a pink sheen. It's so thin though, I'm not able to pick it up on camera. Even the little scribbles here with the heavy bits of ink, you can see a dark halo of ink where the ink appears darker, but in real life you can just barely see some sheen. I'm not a big fan of heavy sheen, so just enough to give the writing some character. I kind of like that. I'm going to begin with a Pilot Kakuno. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. The extra fine lines from this Pilot Kakuno are nice and crisp. You feel a little bit of feedback naturally because it's an extra fine nib, but it was very pleasant to write with. I'll just say that this was really nice. Next, I'll be writing with a Platinum 3776. It has a 14 karat fine nib. Platinum is known for having a little bit of feedback to their nibs, but on this nice, smooth Tomoe River paper, this was again, a very nice writing experience. Next, I'll be writing with my Sailor 1911 Standard. It has a 14 karat medium nib. You can see as the nibs get larger, I'm getting more and more ink on the page, and I think that's also helping the nibs to feel a bit smoother, in addition to the nibs just being wider. Sailor's also known for their pencil type feedback, but in this case, I could hear the feedback, but it felt really nice. It felt kind of chalky smooth. I'm not going to put smooth, but it was a very, maybe I should have put smooth. It is very nice though. Next, I'll be writing with a Pilot Grants. It also has a 14 karat medium nib. The pilot nib, in my experience, pilot medium nibs tend to be a little bit smoother than sailor and platinum medium nibs. But in this case, the ink really felt kind of similar on the page. Just kind of a chalky or buttery smoothness, just barely a hint of feedback to let you know that you're on the page, that you're not going to slide off the page. Again, I'm going to put very nice. In fact, I can tell on this one, it does, we start feeling smooth. It's not that glassy smoothness, but I am going to put smooth on this one if you are sensitive to that. Because as I was writing, I was thinking this one was going to be significantly wetter than the sailor, but you can see they're both putting a similar amount of ink down on the page. Next, I'll be writing with my Pilot Metropolitan. It has a stainless steel cursive medium nib. Okay, this one didn't put down as much ink as the Pilot or the Sailor, but it felt glassy smooth. Sometimes this nib, this calligraphy medium nib, is sensitive to inks in that if the ink is not very saturated, it will feel really dry on the page or it will look really dry. But this looked nice. I was worried about it looking a little undersaturated, looking more like this. But even though it does look like that, that is saturated enough that it doesn't look overly pale. So that was smooth and very pleasant. Next, I'll be writing with the Kaweco Lilliput. It has a stainless steel broad nib. Not as wet as I thought that was going to be, but it was very pleasant. Very smooth, but not glassy smooth. There's just enough feedback. It gave it a velvety type feel, enough feedback to keep you from just slipping and sliding on the page. That was very pleasant. And finally, I'll be writing with a Pen BBS. It has a 1.5 stainless steel stub nib. You can see it's not very wet, and I could kind of tell that it wasn't going to be very wet. It felt nice and smooth and velvety. It was very pleasant to write with. I was just wishing that it was putting a little bit more ink on the page. While I let this dry, I'll take a look at some of the other writing samples. I put a smiley face beside the writing sample that I did with the glass dip nib. It looks really nice. The ink is nice and dark and crisp, and it was pleasant to write with. The ink came off the nib uniformly, so it didn't feel like it was getting dry down here at the end. That was enjoyable. The ink swatch was nice and crisp like it was on Tomoe River paper, but there's more of a difference between the dark end and the lighter end on this paper. Maybe this more absorbent paper pulled more of the ink out of the tweezers at the beginning, leaving it a little drier at the end. I guess because there's more ink down here on the drip, I'm seeing more of the halo of sheen, but there's still not a lot. It's not very visible on the camera. I'm noticing on camera that the ink is looking a little more bright, maybe a little more purple than it is in real life. That's on my viewfinder. I'm not sure in the final video if that will be the case. If it is, I'll make a note in the description. I made a note that the large stub nib felt dry, and you can see it's a bit paler, more pale than the broad nib. The broad nib was really nice to write with. The Pilot Metropolitan, I just put okay here because it felt very pleasant on the page, but when I got done writing, like the larger stub nib, I guess I was spoiled by this broad nib. The stub nibs just looked a bit too pale, didn't look as attractive. On the Pilot Grants, it looks a bit darker because it's putting more ink down, but I just put okay because it felt a little too wet. It felt like the ink was just kind of blobbing out on the paper, just slightly more than I would like it to. The Sailor is putting down about the same amount of ink, but just the way Sailor nibs are ground, and usually I have the same experience with Platinum medium nibs. They're ground in such a way that they put the ink down on the paper more uniformly. There's more feedback on those two nibs, the Sailor and the Platinum, but it was a very nice writing experience. The Platinum Fine nib also had feedback, and because it's finer, I just put okay. The feedback was bordering on unpleasant, for depending on how tolerant you are of feedback. The Kakuno, though, that extra fine nib, was very nice. Provided that you write small enough, though. If you write too large, it can get a little unpleasant. On copy paper, the broader nibs were pleasant enough to write with. The Pilot Metropolitan was one of my favorites. It doesn't look too pale compared to the others, and it was nice and smooth on this paper. But that Pilot Metropolitan, since it doesn't put down the ink quite so fast, it didn't spread or feather like the others did. The wider nibs didn't feather too bad, but there's some small feathers there. The Sailor was nice. The Grants was a little bit on the wet side. All of these felt nice to write with, but the Sailor and the Grants maybe put down a little too much ink. It looks a little too blobby once you get done writing. The Platinum Fine nib had a bit of feedback, but it was pleasant to write with. But out of the two, I liked the Kakuyo Extra Fine better. There wasn't as much feedback. And these two write so fine that you don't really have any feathering. This is a thicker copy paper, so I don't usually have very much bleed through, but you can see the Grants started to bleed through a little bit, and the stub nib wanted to bleed through a little bit. In my Leuchtturm bullet journal, I always do a writing sample with the larger stub nib, and it was very pleasant to write with. This is just what I would call a normal blue. I tend to gravitate toward blues that have maybe a little bit of green in them, those darker teals or dark turquoises, but this ink performs so nicely that it was fun to write with. I want to note here on this Tsubame really smooth paper, these ink swatch papers that I use, that everything was really nice except for two. The Pilot Grants was a little bit too wet, but I want to make a note, I was writing really small. If you were writing larger, then a wetter pen like this, if you're writing larger and faster, a wet nib like this would be more pleasant to write with. The large stub nib, you can see it's writing a little bit dry, and it didn't feel dry. It felt glassy smooth, but I don't know, sometimes a glassy smooth nib can be unpleasant, and in this case it was, and the ink just looks a little too pale. You look at it and you know that you want a little bit more ink on the page. But the little fine nibs were really enjoyable to write with on this really smooth paper. One of the inks that was the most similar to Tsuyu-kusa, at least one of the inks from my collection, was Sailor Ink Studio 143. But even then, it wasn't that similar because it's a little less saturated and it's got more of that chromo shading characteristic. It's not showing up real well on camera. Like this splotch right here is very purple. It's got those purple undertones. I thought Waterman Serenity Blue would be more similar, but it really brings out the purple when you set it beside Tsuyu-kusa. One of the inks in my collection, Diamine Blue Flame, it's a shimmer ink, but it also looks more purple, as well as Azagao. Azagao looks very bright and a bit more purple and more saturated when you set it next to Tsuyu-kusa, and it's got more sheen. Shinkai is more of a blue-black, as well as Erbon Bleu Nuit. It's a little less saturated, but still a blue-black, and so is Diatramentus Sherlock Holmes, also known as Diatramentus Night Blue. And Iroshizuku Kanpeki is much more turquoise, though in my viewfinder here, they look more similar than they really are. I did a writing sample on a small piece of rhodia paper, let it set for a day, and then submerged it in water for 10 minutes. And I was pleasantly surprised. Quite a bit of the ink stayed behind. It blew out a little bit, but leaves behind a very legible amount of ink. It's kind of like the blue version of Takesumi. Okay, now that my Tomoe River paper is dry, let me look. No issues with bleed through, though this thin Tomoe River paper, you can see a bit of show through, but that's common. This was just a really well-behaved ink. When I first got into fountain pens, blues like this didn't interest me at all. And it wasn't until here recently that I actually started using Waterman blue inks. When I started playing around with Esterbrook pens and a couple other vintage pens that kind of struggled with my modern saturated inks, I started using Waterman blue inks, and I found that I enjoy just a nice, well-behaved ink, and I let the pen be kind of the showstopper, the attractive thing. I feel like an ink like this would pair well with like a fancy maquille pen, where the pen is the beautiful piece of art, and then your ink just does its job by being a well-performing ink. All right, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.